Welcome to the LSE. Welcome to this online event on international climate finance. My name is Robert Faulkner. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department here at the LSE. The event is co-hosted by LSE Ideas, which is the LSE's foreign policy think tank, and it's also co-hosted by the LSE Global Economic Governance Commission. So it is part of a series of recent events that explore the current challenges of how to govern the global economy, but is also looking into how to reform global economic governance. Today's focus is on climate change and climate finance in a fractured world, a topic that is surely bound to grow in importance in the coming years as we try to accelerate the net zero transition. We know that in order to halt global warming and help developing countries with their decarbonization effort, a substantial amount of international financial support will be needed. This also explains why questions of climate finance are so controversial, especially at the annual COPs, the climate COPs that bring together the parties to the UN Framework Convention on climate change. The last decade has actually seen significant growth in climate finance flows, but we still struggle to meet the long-standing pledge by developed economies to raise at least $100 billion annually, which was originally made back in 2009. There is therefore a question of how to mobilize more aid. But we must also ensure that climate finance is invested sensibly and allocated effectively, and not just for climate mitigation purposes, but also for the growing needs around climate adaptation. There's then a need for more harmonization of international standards in this area and for international institution building. And so we face a number of challenges as we try to ramp up the global flow of climate finance. And with the recent agreement on creating a loss and damage fund, we now also face the challenge of imagining and creating an entirely new institutional architecture for delivering aid to particularly vulnerable countries. So plenty of questions and challenges that surround this topic, but we're grateful to have two leading experts with us today who will no doubt shed some light on these questions and try to answer them. Let me therefore introduce our distinguished speakers. I welcome Ambassador Patricia Espinosa, who is currently the founding partner and CEO of 1.5, an ESG consulting firm specialized in climate change. Until recently, Ambassador Espinosa was a career diplomat and indeed a respected leader on the global stage with more than 35 years of experience at the very highest levels in multilateral negotiations and diplomacy. Ambassador Espinosa has served in a number of senior roles as the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2016 to 22. She was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Mexico from 2006 to 2012, and she served as Mexico's ambassador to a number of countries, including Germany, Austria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2012, she was appointed Ambassador Emeritus of Mexico, which is the highest recognition that the Mexican government awards its diplomats, and she's widely recognized and widely sought after as an authoritative voice on issues relating to sustainability, environmental stewardship, gender equality, and the protection of human rights. Ambassador, welcome to this session. Our second speaker is Dr. Sandeep Sengupta, who is currently the Global Policy Lead for Climate Change at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, perhaps more widely known as IUCN, based in Switzerland. Sandeep has worked for over 15 years on a wide range of issues from environment to development and natural resource management. And he has served in many functions across a number of areas from government to academia and international organizations. He holds a doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford, and I shall mention he holds a master's degree from the LSE as well. His academic research has focused on the global politics of climate change and its evolution over the last 3 decades. He's also a visiting faculty at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, where he teaches courses on climate change politics and governance. And I should mention that for this session, he's speaking in his own capacity today. I will now invite our panelists to start us off with an opening statement. And I should mention to the audience that once the speakers have finished and once I've invited them for an initial conversation with me, I will open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you would like to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will try and get as many questions into the conversation as possible. All right. So welcome again, Ambassador Espinosa. I'll hand the floor to you now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Faulkner. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you and to your audience. I want to start also by thanking LSE Ideas and LSE Global Economic Governance Commission for the work that you do. I really believe that you are doing the world a great service by fostering an informed discussion on the vital issue of climate finance today, but overall for the work that you're doing on so many issues in these times where we get so much information that is misleading and that is creating confusion around the world. So thank you for that. And thank you also for this opportunity of having this conversation with you and with Dr. Sangupta, whom I also really appreciate. I admire the work within IUCN. And I remember very well the first time I went to the Congress, how impressed I was, the enormous community that is behind IUCN. And, you know, how much room there was still to bring together the dimensions of climate change and conservation. So I think little by little we're doing that, and I feel in a way this conversation today with you is also a contribution to that. So today we're talking about climate finance. So let me start by highlighting how important and how critical is climate finance for all climate action. If we consider that finance is absolutely necessary for any action to occur on mitigation, on adaptation, on capacity building, on technology, we need to really acknowledge that it's not just, you know, another part of the many that need to come together, but that it really is at the center of everything. It is a condition of possibility. Without finance, no action is possible. It sounds very obvious, but sometimes we just feel, you know, there are so many different pieces, and we need to remember that this is actually the case. And this is really one of the reasons why of the three pillars that make the climate regime, finance is regarded as obligatory in a way different than in other development agendas, like the official development aid, or, you know, even the commitments that have been subscribed on official development, the different conferences on official development assistance. In the case of climate, the difference is that the obligation to support the action in developing countries derives from the recognition that there is a historic responsibility by some about the problem that we are facing today in the world. The governments, we also need to acknowledge that governments alone will not be able to provide all the climate finance that the world needs. They must and can act as catalysts that can bring about more ambitious climate finance levels through the application of policies and regulations to ensure that the investments, both in the public and private sectors, are considered and are assessed through the climate lens. There are two goals, in my view, that are equally important and need to be pursued at the same time. On the one hand, we need to significantly increase funding to new projects that are aligned to the international climate regime. On the other hand, we need to withdraw funding deliberately and quickly from carbon-intensive activities. If we say that there is an institution that is now has increased up to 30% its contribution of its portfolio to climate finance, the first thing we need to ask is what happens with the other 70%? Because if the other 70% is still invested in a business as usual way, then that is not going to be effective. We do have a lot of announcements recently, but many are still unclear, and they remain, unfortunately, insufficient. It is a fact that climate finance that we see today is only a fraction of what is needed. According to some calculations and according to some reports, if we would count the needs of developing countries that are contained in the nationally determined contributions, their national climate plans, amount to 5.8 to 5.9 trillion up to 2030. So in the short term, what do we need to do? We need the developed world to deliver on the 100 billion goal per year that was due in 2020. We need to make credible progress in the discussions regarding the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And we need to make progress also on the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025 from the 2019 baseline. That's only 2 years from now. And the MDBs and other multilateral financial institutions need to accelerate the mobilization of financial resources to support developing countries and to support the just transition. It is on this particular issue, it is a fact that these institutions were created decades ago and that the world has changed enormously and the needs have changed enormously. So the reform that needs to take place and that was called for in the decisions in Sharm el-Sheikh must be guided by the goal of enhancing the flow of finance in support of climate action everywhere at the scale and speed that is required. And in this regard, the discussions on the new quantitative climate finance goal is a very good opportunity also to look into many of the relevant aspects for this. One of them has to do with the distinction between developed and developing countries. And I believe that this distinction remains relevant. Why? Because the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement call for the financial assistance from parties with more financial resources, the richer countries, to those that are more vulnerable and have less resources. And this is a way to recognize that the contribution of countries to climate change and their capacity to prevent it and cope with the consequences is very different. There are enormous variations here. However, I do believe that it may be the time to find ways of incentivizing some of the larger, thriving emerging economies to play a more prominent role in financing the transition to this clean and sustainable future. in the regions or in different parts of the world. Regarding the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions, we have also acknowledged always their important role. And actually, they have played an important role in many countries in really advancing their infrastructure needs, in really meeting their needs in the area of health, in many, many areas. But today, what is very important is that we are able to incorporate into the vision of those institutions that no form of finance for economic development and growth can be anything but sustainable. That the only form of development worthy of that name is based on sustainable practice. And an economic activity that is not sustainable cannot be regarded as development at all. So all finance provided by multilateral development banks and international financial institutions must adhere to sustainability criteria, with climate at the top of the list. In this way, we would ensure that the volume of climate financing grows consistently in future years, and that its impact on sustainable development becomes even more effective. We have known actually for many years already that the MDBs are not anymore fit for their purpose. So what we need now are concrete solutions and structural changes. This means launching without delay the relevant change processes in each of these institutions, led by those that are committed to achieve this much delayed transformation. I would like to see, coming out of the spring meetings, who is going to do what to deliver these structural changes before COP28. Delaying this is delaying action, and the IPCC report that we have just received this week is extremely clear. The urgent action is needed. We really have no time to waste. In this regard, I believe that the members of these institutions, MDBs and IFIs, particularly those who have more power in the decision-making bodies, have an enormous responsibility to make this reform possible. Now, just a few words on whether climate finance is cost or opportunity. And here, let me refer to what the expert group on climate finance has pointed out. Acting on climate is not a cost, as many have said, but rather an opportunity to unlock new and better forms of growth and development. And we are seeing already today that the proliferation of new low emissions technologies with rapidly failing costs, like the case of the solar energy, along with greater awareness of the advantages afforded by the transition to a regenerative circular economy, are the driving forces of a major transformation. So we need to have an appropriate finance framework that allows the world to go from billions to trillions devoted to climate action. Now, just a few closing remarks. All human needs, whether it is related to water, to food, to health, to energy, must be addressed with financial resources that foster the transformation of the energy system, that restore the damage that we have done to our natural capital, that invest in sustainable agriculture and reduce the vulnerability of developing countries to climate change. Finance needs to support every aspect of climate action. It should increase ambition in mitigation by accelerating the spread of new and clean technologies for a just energy transition. On adaptation, it should support improvement in infrastructure and new technologies, new approaches to reduce the exposure to climate risk. On loss and damage, we need to have financial mechanisms that allow countries to recover after devastating effects of extreme weather events. And the new collective quantified goal on finance should be an opportunity to really conduct a very respectful, serious, and well-informed process of interaction with the spirit of really making this change and understanding that in today's world, collaboration and climate finance means the greater good for humanity. Thank you very much, Professor. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Espinosa. These were very, very powerful and rousing opening remarks. We will return to some of the points you raised in the discussion. Let me now hand the floor, though, to Dr. Sengupta for his opening remarks. Sandeep.
Great. Thank you, Robert. I'm very happy to be joining today's event, particularly also as an LSE alumnus. And as you noted at the outset, I will be speaking in my personal capacity. I would also like to start off by acknowledging Ambassador Espinosa's presence here and thanking her for her leadership on climate change. It is indeed an honor to be on this panel with her here today. We are discussing a very important topic today. In the 12 minutes or so that I have, I will try to paint a bit of the landscape in which the issue of climate finance is situated and needs to be considered. I have structured my intervention in 3 parts. In the first part, I will provide some background on the current state of the world and the growing impacts of climate change in it. In the second part, I will present some of the current analysis on the source and distribution of greenhouse gases that cause climate change, as this remains central, in my view, to questions of climate finance and indeed climate justice. In my final part, I will outline how international understandings on climate finance itself have evolved over time and where things stand at present. So to begin, first of all, there is no doubt whatsoever that we are living in a deeply fractured world today. Perhaps for the first time since the end of the Cold War, there is serious and growing geopolitical conflict and competition, including among the great powers. This can be seen not only in the current war in Ukraine, but also in the growing tensions and rivalry between the US and China. In addition, around 2 billion people, or over a quarter of the world's population, are currently living in conflict-affected countries and facing humanitarian crisis. There is also growing nationalism, authoritarianism, and political polarization in various countries, including in the West, which is making international cooperation harder. The North-South divide, unfortunately, has not disappeared either, and by some accounts has even worsened, with global poverty and hunger on the rise. Also, wherever one looks, deep inequality defines our world today, whether it is in the unequal distribution of vaccines or that of global wealth, with the bottom 50% holding less than 1% of total global wealth and the top 1% holding 45%. Developing countries in particular have been impacted in the last 2-3 years, not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also with rising food and energy costs and growing levels of public indebtedness. In other words, the mood music or the background conditions against which we are considering the topic of climate change and climate finance today is not a very positive one. Of course, the impacts of climate change have made things even worse. The IPCC synthesis report that was released this week confirms that climate change has led to widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. Vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to climate change are being disproportionately affected. Over 3 billion people are living in situations today that are highly vulnerable to climate change and which face mortality risks from climate-related extreme weather events that are 15 times higher than others. The World Bank estimates that climate change can push up to 130 million people into poverty over the next decade, and over 200 million could become climate migrants by 2050. So to sum up, the overall situation is really quite serious. Let me now quickly move to my second point. It is pertinent, I think, to remind ourselves about the source or origins of the emissions that is causing the climate problem today, as this is central to questions of responsibility for both climate action and climate finance. The key point to flag here is that climate change has been caused by the historical accumulation of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution, i.e. since about 1750 to 1850. Therefore, it is the cumulative stock of emissions over this entire 250-year period that we need to keep in mind, rather than the year-to-year or the decade-to-decade flow of emissions. If we look back in time, the ministerial declaration of the Second World Climate Conference clearly noted in 1990 that the developed world was responsible for about 3/4 of all emissions of greenhouse gases. Indeed, it was the very process of industrialization and development which generated these emissions that was the very basis of the wealth and prosperity of the industrialized North. However, what is remarkable, as noted in the IPCC's 6th Assessment Working Group 3 report, which was released last year, is that although emissions from developing countries have grown over the last 30 years and those from the developed world have contracted, developed countries nevertheless still remain responsible for nearly 60% of the stock of cumulative fossil fuel and industrial emissions between 1850 and 2019. By contrast, Africa contributes only 3% of these historic cumulative emissions, and the world's least developed countries, which make up around 14% of the world's population, to only 0.4%. Also, as the underlying IPCC report concludes, even though the relative share of developed countries in the flow of current global emissions decreased from 41% to 24% over the last 30 years, in absolute terms, they have not managed to reduce their emissions substantially. Other scholars have similarly also estimated that if both historical as well as consumption-based emissions are taken into account, rather than just production or territorial-based emissions, the North remains responsible for around 70% of cumulative global emissions that is causing the climate breakdown today. This is notwithstanding the dramatic rise in emissions that we have seen, especially from China and India over the last decade. Let me now move on to my third part, which focuses more directly on the question of climate finance. It is firstly important to note that it was largely on account of the unequal distribution of global emissions, which I have just described, that the world's governments agreed in 1992 under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that the climate system should be protected on the basis of equity and in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Under the convention, developed countries agreed that they would take the lead in combating climate change and its adverse effects. An important legal obligation, as Ambassador Espinosa also pointed out, that developed countries also undertook back then, is that they would provide the financial resources needed to cover the agreed full incremental costs of implementing all the mitigation and adaptation measures that developing countries took. They also agreed that these would be new and additional resources, more along the lines, if you will, of the polluter pays principle and not existing ODA or charity. Yet, as some have argued, especially in the developing world, some of these original understandings over climate finance have gradually become more qualified and ambiguous over time. For example, in Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries committed themselves to the more specific goal of jointly mobilizing, or whatever mobilizing means, $100 billion a year by 2020. But they also qualified that this would come from a wide variety of sources, public and private. Likewise, in Paris in 2015, they reiterated their commitment to continue with this goal to 2025, and for a new collective quantified goal to be set from a floor of $100 billion per year thereafter. But which countries exactly would contribute to this new collective goal remains unspecified. In fact, the Paris Agreement also suggested that the Northern lead in mobilizing climate finance would now need to be as part of a global effort, and it also encouraged, for the first time, other countries to provide such support voluntarily. So where do we stand now? Calculating and assessing international climate finance remains enormously complicated, not least because there is no agreed official definition for it. With regards to the specific $100 billion a year goal, according to the OECD's estimates, climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries for developing countries reached $83 billion in 2020. But it is important to note that these figures have been contested, and previous such OECD assessments have also been poorly received or simply rejected by developing country representatives and academic observers. For instance, against the OECD claim of mobilizing around $60 billion of climate financing in 2014, India's Ministry of Finance argued that if methodological shortcomings and loopholes were taken into account, only around $2 billion could be rightly counted. Likewise, others have argued that much of the claimed climate financing is relabeling or redirection of existing ODA flows rather than being new and additional as had been originally agreed. But whichever way one looks at it, the fact remains is that this promise still remains unfulfilled. And it is important to underscore that the full and satisfactory delivery of this $100 billion a year goal will be central to retaining trust between North and South in the climate space. It is also important to note that this $100 billion per year figure is only a fraction of the overall climate finance that is needed to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade and ensure a climate resilient world. Indeed, the Paris Agreement itself also agreed on a larger goal of making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low GHG emissions and climate resilient development. According to the 5th biennial assessment done by the UNFCCC, estimated global finance flows in 2019-2020 were around $800 billion US, with a vast majority focusing on mitigation efforts. The assessment also noted that this is only 1/3 of the annual investment that is needed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees centigrade. There is now also growing recognition that additional funds will need to be set aside for addressing the permanent and irreversible losses and damages that are happening due to climate change. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, a historic decision was taken to establish funding arrangements, including a dedicated fund to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change in responding to loss and damage. But many of its operational details remain unclear and will need to be worked out this year. Finally, I would like to end on a positive note. There is a lot that is happening at the moment in the climate finance space. There is growing recognition of the importance of phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies, including agriculture and fossil fuel subsidies amounting to trillions of dollars. There is growing recognition of the importance of phasing in carbon pricing in an increasing number of jurisdictions around the world. And there are important conversations and initiatives that have been started that aim for a fundamental transformation of the international financial system, as Ambassador Espinosa also pointed out. One such example, for example, is the Bridgetown Initiative led by the Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. But whichever climate financing option one considers, the key point is that political will and government leadership will be central to all of this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandeep. And I think you've very nicely rounded off this opening session of statements by highlighting some of the more current challenges that we face in this area. I want to start indeed with the most recent decision to create a loss and damage fund, which was taken at COP27, which you mentioned, Sandeep. And I just wanted to open this round of initial questions and answers from the panel with that question of what significance this decision has. Do you see it as something that marks a sea change in the discussion around adaptation and loss and damage? It is a fund that is yet to be created. The rules, as mentioned, are yet to be agreed. Yet it is also a highly significant move, particularly for developed countries in the north that have so far resisted this move. So, Ambassador Espinosa, may I ask you first, you of course have long-standing involvement with the COP process and the negotiations that can drag on for a long time and that have indeed not produced much progress on loss and damage. How do you interpret this recent decisions, and do you see it with some sense of optimism that it could indeed provide a breakthrough?
Well, I do think, yeah, absolutely. This is one of the very important issues that, in my view, will be central to the success of the COP28 this year. And it is true. As Dr. Sengupta was saying, the details are not yet done, and this will be probably also like. Normally, because of the complications and the complexity of putting together, over almost 200 countries' views into one single agreement, it may be a complicated negotiating process on how, where, what will be the different guidelines for the work of the fund. But I do believe that what is absolutely needed is that this year there are some signals that the resources will be flowing into in order to address the needs of the countries that are requiring this kind of support. The decision itself, I think it's of course a very welcome development in the process. I think it shows that the discussions and the requests and the calls from so many developing countries have finally come to a moment where it is understood that if those calls are not really regarded seriously, then also, the whole process will be losing credibility. So if we are going to speak about, adaptation and mitigation, why are we not talking about loss and damage? Because it's very clear, losses and damages are already happening. And the amount of the losses that we see are just really indescribable for some countries. Even if we unfortunately cannot give a number or some kind of signal regarding the loss of lives. What does it mean for somebody to lose your loved ones in a flood or a drought where children are starving? All of that, there's no way to calculate, but what we do know is that the losses are already happening. So I think this was something that finally came to produce, came to a certain maturity and produce this decision. But again, I think that what is very, very critical is that we can see serious, open, good and well-intentioned process of negotiations for the fund and how and where it will be established. But secondly, also some indication of financial resources flowing into this issue. I think this is going to be very critical. Countries that have been advocating for this issue have also been advocating for more capacity building in their structures in order to be able to be better prepared for those losses and damages. In my view, and this is what I was advocating and making calls for when I was at the head of the Secretariat, this is an issue that cannot be ignored. It is a reality. It is the facts are very clear. So we need to see how we can, acknowledge it and how we can translate that collective responsibility for the climate change emergency into specific actions to those that are suffering the most. And this has to do, with loss and damage and with adaptation and other parts of the regime. But in this particular point, I think, the loss and damage fund, we really need to see progress.
That is indeed the point that I wanted to raise with Sandeep, the question of urgency, and whether, Sandeep, given the comments you've made earlier about the ambiguity in the pledges that have been made so far and the difficulty of mobilizing sufficient funding levels, whether you have any hope that the new fund that is to be created would provide the kind of speedy funding that is needed to address what is indeed an urgent climate crisis. Loss and damage is not some future event. This is happening right now. We've seen this last year with the floods in Pakistan and in other parts of the world, that people are suffering now. So what gives you hope, if it does indeed, that there will be loss and damage funding forthcoming in the near future?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I mean, in terms of what gives me hope, I think, as Ambassador Espinosa, very clearly pointed out, there is now this recognition that loss and damage is not an abstract concept. It's happening here and now, and it's impacting people, it's impacting, vulnerable communities in particular across the world, across a whole suite of issues. It's not just economic losses, but also non-economic losses and damages. And perhaps the clearest illustration of this was the flood that you referred to in Pakistan. So I think, as Ambassador Espinosa pointed out, for ensuring the credibility of the system, they will need to be, an adequate loss and damage fund that is, adequately capitalized and can be operationalized to make a difference as soon as possible. The funds are there in a sense, even if we look at what happened in the aftermath of the flood in Pakistan, there was this event that was convened by co-convened, if I recall correctly, by the UN Secretary General and the Prime Minister of Pakistan in Geneva earlier this year, that raised about $9 billion of funding just for one single flood event alone. Now, that should give you, on the one hand, a sense of the scale of loss and damage funding that will be required. But on the other hand, the fact that that amount of funding was pledged itself is a positive sign. And as I mentioned earlier, there are other conversations that are happening in the moment to try and unlock funds from the international financial system in a more structured manner. And hopefully some of that will help this effort too.
Thank you for that. I'd like to raise a second issue before I turn the table to the audience, and please, audience members, do send us your questions in the Q&A function. I'd like to address the issue that Ambassador Espinosa mentioned in her remarks earlier on, which is to do with whether the international financial institutions are fit for purpose. I think this is the expression you used, and you doubted whether the MDBs are indeed fit for purpose. It's a big agenda, the reform agenda for the World Bank and for other institutions, but is there a single innovation, a single reform that you can think of that would really help us to put the institutional infrastructure right, or create the conditions for a more effective use of the existing funding and future funding? Do you have any specific ideas of what can be done in this area? Debates around reforming the World Bank and the IMF are not new. They have been tried before. But what do you envisage as the sort of the critical innovation that you would see? Ambassador Espinosa, may I start with you again? You're muted. If you could unmute yourself, thank you.
Okay, now? Yes, okay, great. So I think that what I have been hearing from developing countries repeatedly has been, this incredible difficulty to get access to resources. That's one thing. The process itself, the ways that applications need to be done, the requirements for applications to be accepted and even considered are very, very difficult for developing countries. And some of them have learned to build capacities in some areas of the government. And, having been in the government before, I can also tell you, it's very difficult. If you have only the people in the finance ministry, the ones who are able enough to make these kind of proposals, it means the chances that you in the environment ministry or agriculture ministry or elsewhere in the government can get even the internal process and get the support of the very skilled people is really very difficult. So that has been one part. I wonder, I'm thinking always also on how to build up some better and more and very, very neutral capacity building facility that could be useful for anybody, right? I have the impression, I come from the diplomatic sector, I studied international relations. I have the impression that we need much more finance experts, but that are dedicated to these areas, right? On the development side, how to do this, and that's people that can look at the situation as a whole, not only when you are talking about a proposal for applying for resources for let's say a water treatment facility. You need to look at the reality of the community. Who is there? What are the factors that are making the political side? Who are the authorities? With whom would you need to talk? The guidelines and policies and regulations. Are there some changes needed, right? So that it becomes a work that goes together between the access to the funds and the creation of that enabling environment. But if we continue to separate those, it's going to be very difficult, because then the full, yes, there is a very clear responsibility on the governments to create this enabling environment. But sometimes they need some help in order to identify exactly how should they be or what should they be doing to create that.
Thank you for that. Sandeep, same question to you. Can you think of a single intervention in that reform efforts that would make a difference to future climate finance?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Firstly, I just want to agree 100% with what Ambassador Espinosa just said, and just on, because it's awfully difficult, and we've seen it in our own experience as well, for developing countries to access the finance, even from, the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the Paris Agreement, like the GEF or the GCF, for all the reasons that you mentioned, but also for the time, for the time horizons that these projects have, which are often, short term, limited to 5 years, whereas the actual requirement, runs over decades. But in terms of, to respond to your question, perhaps, a new initiative that has, of course, got a lot of attention recently is the Bridgetown initiative that I was referring to earlier. And this is, about calling for, if you will, transformative and structural reform of the international financial system as a whole, including, through greater allocation of new special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund, and allocating that towards climate efforts in particularly vulnerable developing countries around the world. So I think, because again, I mean, one of the challenges of our world is that we often deal with all of these problems in individual silos. And if, for example, the system would enable the unlocking of funds that are needed at scale to address climate change, but also the other developmental challenges that developing countries also often face, then that might be one way of, making real progress in the sort of scale that matters.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we have just under 10 minutes left. I'd like to get some questions from the audience into this round. So I'm going to quickly read out a few questions and I'll ask for quick responses from both our panelists so that I can get as many questions in. First of all, Chelsea Yang has a two-part question. The first question is, are there important levers that we can use to accelerate climate finance and enact the just transition? So what could politically get more funding going in this area? And secondly, she's asking, how would you advise finance graduate students about future career choices? What can young professionals do to get involved in climate finance? Any such suggestions? Sandeep, do you want to start on this occasion?
All right, thanks. Maybe I'll have a shot at the last question on, what can finance, climate finance graduates try to do. I think the first thing is, you might be a climate finance specialist now, and as again, I refer back to what Ambassador Espinosa said, that there is a real need for people who understand finance to be engaged in the climate space and in the development space. But it's also important, I think, for the people who get engaged in these spaces from a climate science, from a finance side, to understand the history of why we have got to where we have got to at the moment, and not just look for, if you wish, lazy solutions. There are deeper causes that have brought us to where we are today. And if we need to build solutions that last, then we need to, in a sense, take into account some of these deeper factors into consideration. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Ambassador, there was the question of how to leverage more funding and what political tools we might have, but also perhaps you could offer some advice for young professionals wanting to move in that direction.
Yes, well, first of all, on the young professionals, really to my advice would be to really combine their expertise with this broader view of the development needs, and I think this is an extraordinary moment for young people, because in my view there are very few moments in history where humanity has the opportunity to make the right choices. And as we are reading every day and every year, every month, all these reports, and the science is getting better and better about what it is really happening with climate change and where we are going, I think this is the moment where the youth, the young people who will be very soon the leaders in all different areas in the world, will be the ones to take the decisions. So is this it is a moment for them to take that, I would not say responsibility, because I think also that young people are carrying already a big burden on their shoulders. I would say it is a big opportunity for them to take the right decisions and to change the course of how the world is developing. And it's some are talking about a fourth industrial revolution. You can name it as you want, but what is very clear is that there is the need to make a full structural transformation. So I would advise finance students to get this broader view, and when you are a diplomat, or you are just an ordinary person on the street, and you talk to a finance person, a finance specialist, you normally don't understand what they are saying, right? They are saying, I mean, we are seeing it now with these very important decisions regarding raising of interest rates or not, and inflation, and people don't understand. We need to make this, you know, the finance knowledge and the finance practice much more accessible. Now, what important levers for accelerating climate finance? I think, you know, the work together with the private sector is very, very important. It's very clear that governments alone will not be able to provide all the financing. So if we can have some, you know, in my view, we need to work on alliances or coalitions on different sectors or for different communities. It depends, but I think it is really bringing those together. Think about opportunity for electrification of public transportation. Yeah, well, bringing together, you know, the finance people, those who provide the electric buses, the local authorities, the communities. That is what makes things happen.
Right, thank you. There are lots of other questions, and apologies to those that I can't bring into the conversation. I'm going to combine two questions. One is from Jack Steenson, who's a student here at the LSE in the Environment Development Program. He asks about conditions for making sure that any finance investments in the climate area are used effectively on the ground. And there's a second question by Mazna Mansour from the University of Glasgow, who asks about a particular way of leveraging climate finance through so-called offsetting projects, which have become very popular in the developing world. But the question is, are these put to good use, these funds? And is there perhaps a danger here that we are spending money and channeling it into developing countries, perhaps without adequate controls? We have only 1 or 2 minutes left, so perhaps a quick answer from both of you to round off this session. Ambassador Espinosa, I'll start with you.
Well, yes, very quickly on the first question, how to make sure that the impacts of the investments is maximized. I think that we need to promote and support all efforts towards more transparency and accountability, not only from governments, but also from non-state actors. I think that is very important. Efforts are being done within the UN and also beyond. So I think those are the kind of efforts that we would need to support. And regarding the carbon markets and offsetting, I think that also there we are. If you look at the report on integrity of the pledges by non-state actors that was produced like last year by a group of experts that was put together by the Secretary General, there are also some initial guidelines, but basically it has to do with making sure that any offsetting really is done after having made all efforts possible in order to reduce emissions and also for projects that are really credible and that represent an addition to what would be happening otherwise. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Sandeep, a very short final word from you.
Yeah, maybe, I agree with everything that was just said. It's really important, while considering offsetting options and mechanisms that are out there, not to end up in a situation when you're actually greenwashing. And there is guidance that is available. For example, Oxford has released the Oxford Principles for Carbon Offsetting, which if followed can probably result in better outcomes. And maybe one very quick final point, I think private finance, of course, is critical, but one shouldn't forget the importance of public finance in the climate debate. And after all, climate protection is an international public good. And we need international public finance as well to help deliver that. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. A perfect concluding remark. All that's left for me to do is to thank our panelists, Ambassador Espinosa and Dr. Sengupta, for taking part in this conversation. Thank you to the audience for sending in good questions. Apologies, I couldn't take many more questions. There were lots of interesting to pick. And thank you for listening in to this event hosted by LSE Ideas. There are other events in this series that you can tune into. This will be recorded and you can watch it all over again. Clearly, climate finance will stay with us on the international agenda and will grow in importance. We need to focus on this and work on this. Thank you all for listening in, and see you at the next event.